What's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week's episode, I think, is going to be my last Aetherdrift dedicated episode. I mean, I've sort of locked myself into this being the last one, calling it my final thoughts on Aetherdrift Limited. Any further episodes would have to be like final thoughts. But on this final episode, it's going to be a mix of kind of where the format's landed, my takes on how I'm seeing the format today, how I'm drafting it differently compared to, week one, week two. So sort of like a mini state of the format address episode in that way, but also just filling in the gaps of things I haven't talked about on previous episodes. So cards, archetypes, interactions, bunch of little tidbits that I think are going to be helpful. So basically, if you're still drafting the format in the final weeks here, I just want to give you one final booster shot of things to think about when you're drafting, playing, things that'll just make the process a bit smoother, things that I think will help you win a bit more. Let's just jump in. So if you think back to the beginning of the format, week one, week two, if you watched the first State of the Format episode where I just gave my initial impressions of what's going on in the set, I think the two biggest defining features of the format were, one, the color balance, just green being phenomenally good and white being, not so good. And two, the fact that the games kind of had a different pace to them than the games in recent formats, right? The games kind of felt a lot slower. They felt a lot more about the late game, less about, okay, who can go one drop, two drop, three drop, curve out, kind of just a different cadence to how the games were played. So I want to take a look back, revisit those two concepts, the color balance and the sort of speed or the cadence of the games, and see where I've landed on them today. Because I have, kind of similar takes to what I had on day one or week one, but at this part of the format, they're slightly more nuanced takes. I think there's a bit more room for not just putting a stamp on like green's great and white's bad, or just like, oh yeah, all the games in the format are super slow. Because I don't think either of those things are true when it comes down to it. I think there is a bit more nuance to them. Let's start by talking about color balance and archetype balance and what I've been more willing / less willing to draft as the format's gone on. So my journey through the format went something like this. It was like week one and week two, I was drafting a ton of green, because often what happens on week one of a format or week two of a format, you get half the player base knowing what's up, knowing what the good cards are. They're tuned into streams and podcasts and such. And the other half of the people drafting, maybe not so much. I mean, definitely, even people who don't tune into content, they can tell when the opponent casts a Migraine Ketrodon, oh wait, that's a really big problem. I should probably draft that card a little higher next time. People catch on even if they're not all super tuned in. But at the same time, you do get an effect where not everybody drafting at your table will know that the good cards are the good cards. You get to reap the rewards of that, and you get to just draft the best cards in the set for a little while, right? That was kind of what I was doing week one, week two. And then around week three, I'd say, I found myself splashing a little bit more, because while I was still drafting green, I could still get, 10, 11, 12 quality green cards in my deck. It was getting a little bit harder to make good playables, right? I found myself reaching into other colors to make sure that my card quality remained high, and it, wasn't free. Green wasn't free anymore. After that happened, starting around like week four or end of week three, I started drafting a lot of the Esper decks, right? I did a whole episode about the Esper decks, blue-white, blue-black, and black-white. And those were the decks that were open, because I think everybody drafting at that point, week two, week three, they knew, they got the memo. Green is good. You had 6-ish people fighting for green at a table, on average, I would say. Maybe that's overshooting it a bit, but I felt like that, And I was just like, all right, well, I'm going to pick up what other people are putting down. I want to also kind of learn what these Esper decks are all about, learn what really makes a blue-black deck tick. I had a lot of fun figuring out how to make white-black work, and that turned out to be my pet deck, actually, by the end of the format. The deck that I felt like I was drafting a lot more than other people. And then that brings us to today, where if you look back at my past 20 or 25 drafts or so, I don't think there's much of a pattern to be found in what colors or decks I'm drafting. Like, I'm not biasing too hard towards a certain color or certain decks or anything, because I feel like the format has self-corrected. There's nothing really to exploit. I feel like it's a pretty balanced format, because the people drafting it, generally, I would say at most arena tables, you're not just going to get fed some awesome busted green deck or some awesome busted Esper deck. It happens once in a while. There's always exceptions. But yeah, there's nothing left to exploit, basically. So when there's nothing left to exploit, you should just treat every single draft as its own thing. Don't go in thinking, okay, well, green's been cut lately. That was maybe true on week three, when you could kind of observe that trend. If you looked on 17 lands, you could even see that. But today, like I said, I think things have mellowed out, things have balanced out. This isn't to say that I'm not still weighing color preference and color strength, right? Because, when it comes down to it, there are still more good green cards and black cards and blue cards in the format than there are good white and red cards in the format. So just law of averages here. More tables can support more green drafters than they could a white drafter. So I still do bias that way slightly in the draft. But the difference is when I open a good white bomb or a red bomb or, fourth, fifth pick, I get the hint that white and red are open, I am very willing to draft them, right? There's nothing wrong with that. So at this point of the format, in a format that I believe has mostly self-corrected, and that's key, right? Some formats don't self-correct. Some formats there is color imbalance, and for whatever reason, people don't pick up on it as readily as they should, and it's just like, okay, well, I drafted red all format, and that was the best color. Nobody was really fighting for it to the degree that I think they should. But when you do have a format like this one that I think has self-corrected, one of the keys to success is knowing how to draft most of the decks in the format, so that when your seat wants you to draft white-black, wants you to draft red-black, you can do that, right? When you see that fourth pick Gastel Thrillseeker, that's the red-black uncommon, you can snap that up and be like, ooh, okay, well, this is a really good thing to do. I don't really have too much direction at this point. This pack also has a few good black-red cards. Maybe black-red is what I'm supposed to be doing. And for something actionable related to all that, one thing that I've noticed amongst the draft logs that I've reviewed from other people, the people I coach, is that people are a little too unwilling to switch out of their colors, or a little bit too unwilling to pivot or speculate early in the draft in this format. And so let's use that Gastel Thrillseeker as an example. I've seen a lot of drafts that go something along the lines of, first pick a good green common, right? Let's say a Scurryfoot. And then second pick, you pick a Ketrodon, right? Okay, so a pretty good green start. Third pick, maybe doesn't have a green common, maybe not a green common you're excited about. Like, the common is Broken Wings, and you're like, okay, I'm probably not going to take that. Maybe you take a card of a different color. And then you get to pick 4. And once again, no good green cards to pick from. And the option is like Gastel Thrillseeker or Keen Buccaneer, right? The blue looting exhaust creature. So Keen Buccaneer, I love me a Keen Buccaneer, don't get me wrong. But I think the Gastel Thrillseeker is much, much better. And Keen Buccaneer, you can go, okay, I can play this with my green cards, right? You're kind of still weighing, well, I'll take a weaker monocolored card, the Buccaneer over Thrillseeker, because that lets me play the green cards maybe. But you didn't take in that, you didn't take a good green card last pack. There wasn't a good green card pick for, probably you're fighting for green, right? So by taking the Buccaneer, you're basically saying, I want to take a power level hit, because I think I'm still going to be able to play the green cards here. When you could just take a much, much better card, at least on speculation, right? And, if you watched Sierkiewicz's latest appearance on Limited Resources, he did this whole thing last month where he was talking about how if you just take the best card for the first few picks in the draft, that on average results in, better drafts overall, right? It just means that you get to get more powerful cards in your deck. It means that you're staying open. It means that you're being flexible. So, I don't want to have this example apply to every single draft you do. I'm not saying you should always pivot hard for the Thrillseeker. I'm just saying I've observed a lot of draft starts that are like, okay, solid green cards or solid black cards or whatever it is. And then people just get tunnel vision basically too early. I think it's still a very good idea because there's a lot of viable archetypes, a lot of really powerful cards. Just lean a little more towards taking the best card. And this is, considering that you know how to draft all the decks, right? If you don't know how to draft red-black, you don't know the cards you're supposed to prioritize, then maybe it's not a good idea. But that's part of having, all the decks as tools in your tool belt at this point in the format. You really want to be able to say, hey, when this is open, when this is something I should do, when it's an option in a pack that I can go toward, I want to be the person drafting the sicko red-black deck that I face sometimes. So going back to color preference, color bias, and, where I kind of see things right now, as much as I'm willing to draft pretty much anything, I still think you should bias away from the lesser colors and towards the good colors, early on anyways, when you're making your early picks, when you're making those tiebreaker picks. So you take the white card or take the green card, you take the green card generally. But one thing that I've changed my tune on as I've drafted more and more is red. And I, just like white, don't think it's undraftable or anything. There's no color it's undraftable. I'll draft it when it's open. But I see it more like white. I see red more like white than I do the other colors. Because for black, green, and blue, I'm pretty happy to get into those for their commons. I think there's a good depth of commons for those colors. I think for red, though, not so much. There's only really 3 red commons that I'm actively looking for in most of my decks. That's Thunderhead Gunner, Crash and Burn, and Lightning Strike. So the 4 or 5 reach that makes you never draw lands again, and the 2 removal spells. And even the removal spells, Crash and Burn, Lightning Strike, they're solid, but they're nothing amazing in this format. Red's uncommons, there's some good ones in there, but there's not a ton of them. Red, mostly I get into because of rares. There's actually a lot of really good red rares. But I kind of treat it like white, where I want to move in when it's open. I want to move in when I open up, an engineer or dragon-making engineer or a Bastronaut or a Boommobile, when I've already got a really good card. I don't really want to move in because I see, okay, some pretty good commons, some pretty good uncommons. I'll have it as my secondary support color sometimes. I'll move into it later, say start blue, and the good blue-red discard payoffs are coming my way, sure, I'm happy to draft it. Again, it's not that I'm cutting it out of my repertoire. It's just that, just like white, I treat it as I'll draft this when I have a reason to, when I think it's open. Less, okay, I'm just happy to draft it if I see some hints of this color being open. So as far as navigating drafts, I think it's helpful to think of things that way. I think it's helpful to think, okay, well, if I can play the good, the green cards, the black cards, the blue cards, what I think is the strongest colors in the set, I'm going to want to plant my flag. I'm going to want to have the opportunity to do that, but I am willing to move into white and red when the time is right. Next up, let's talk about the other big picture framing point, what really makes this format feel like this format and feel a bit different than other formats, and that's just the late game, and the fact that you get to the late game a little more often. The boards stall out a little more often. You sometimes have those 11, 12, 20 turn games. I'd say more than 50% of my games, even at this point in the format, go till turn 8 or 9. Where I feel a bit differently now, though, compared to how I might have felt on week 1, is I do want to make sure I play a 2-drop on 2. I think I even said in the State of the Format episode, like, if you don't play a 2-drop on 2, it's not the end of the world. And it's not still, right? It's not just like game over necessarily. But I do feel like it's good to be able to play a good 2-mana card on 2. I think that you face red-black and white-black and just the more aggressive decks often enough that, if you face 3 of those decks in your drafts and you just don't play a 2-on-2, you're probably just going to die, right? They probably will run you over. So the fact that those decks are being drafted a bit more often, you see them a bit more often, means that I've been trying to have my curve look a little bit more like a classic draft curve, not so much like super top-end heavy. I really do want to have like 6 or 7 cards to play before turn 3, board-affecting cards. And this is another thing that I've seen from other people when I look at their decks and go, okay, like, what would you change about this deck? Or is there anything this deck is missing? I think people are undershooting on 2-drops, right? They're now not playing enough 2-drops. And if I'm to guess, I don't necessarily think it's like, people have heard the format the games go a little bit longer, so it's like, oh, I don't need to respect the early game. I don't think it's quite that. I think it's a little more, there's not that many 2-drops that are super enticing to draft, right? There's not a lot of standout premium cheap cards in the set. A lot of the premium cards cost 3, 4, 5, 6 mana. And so what that means is naturally in the draft, if you're just drafting the good cards, the appealing cards, you will end up with fewer 2-drops. So I think it's something you have to actively go, okay, I will make sure that I'm drafting enough good cheap cards. And then you get to the problem, though, of like, well, if I'm drafting a lot of cheap cards, am I going to be disadvantaged when I face a really good late game deck, a big green deck? And the answer is yes. The answer is that, sure, if you have more 2-drops, just like, random 2-mana 2/2s, you'll be a bit better against the aggressive decks that you face once in a while. But you will suffer versus the decks where it's like, well, I'd really like this 2-drop to be impactful in the late game. So what's the solve for that? Well, the solve for that is to make sure that the cheap cards that are very impactful in the late game still do something. You're taking those super, super highly. And so we swung all the way back around to take 2-drops super highly because, the good ones anyways, because the good ones I think are at a premium. You don't see them a lot. And the ones I'm looking for are ones that retain their relevance, right, on turn 5, 6, 7, 8, because the games go that long. So what I'm looking for is stuff like Wreckage Wickerfolk. Wreckage Wickerfolk is just one of the best commons. This thing's excellent. The 2-mana 1/3 flyer, Surveil 2. Looking for stuff like Skystreak Engineer. That's the blue 1/3 that exhausts to put 2 counters on it. It's got flying as well. Venom Sack Lagak, the Death Toucher. Engine Rat. Engine Rat's been a card that I've come up and up and up and up on. I just treat it as a premium common at this point. The single mana Death Toucher that can make your opponent lose 2 life for 6 mana. Also, the busted 2-drop, something like Glory Heath Links. The 2-mana 1/3 lifelink goes and gets a land. There was a discussion on Lords Unlimited this week where Ben and Ethan were kind of debating, is this card really good, or is it maybe a little bit overrated? And, Ethan kind of argued for it being a little bit overrated. I think I'm Team Ben on this argument personally, where, Ben was more arguing for the card being good, because even if you think the card itself isn't like, busto 2-drop that demands take over the game, which I'd argue it actually is in a lot of games, but even if you don't think that, I think the fact that its value above replacement is so high, like so much better than the next white 2-drop, for example, that you should value it super, super highly. So yeah, if you're trying to get to that number of, 6 or 7 cheap things, it's hard sometimes. You don't just end up with a bunch of Lagaks, a bunch of Wickerfolk. So what I do want to do is make sure I go to like the next level up, right? If you can't get those premium ones, I still want to make sure that my 2-drops retain some sort of relevance as the game goes on. So what am I talking about here? Well, something with a mana sink on it. Deathless Pilot, that's a good example. The 2-mana 2/2 in black that you can return it from your grave for 4 mana. Like, that's a card that I don't mind filling out my 2-drop slot if I'm just missing some cheap stuff. Leonin Surveyor, that's the 2 mana 2/2 that has start your engines. First strike on your turn, you can exile it from your grave to draw a card when you're at max speed. Like, that's a card that, does something at least in the late game. Even stuff like the vanilla creatures that trade up. So Tyrox, the red 4/1, Gibberek Omnivore, the 2 mana 3/2. I still like these cards because they trade with the 4s, they trade with the 5s sometimes. So, those definitely count. They're not the premium ones, right? All the ones I'm talking about here, they're not the premium ones, but they still do a job of being like not a blank on turn 5, which is really what you want. I even like Midnight Mangler a lot more than I used to. This is the 2 mana 3/3 vehicle that becomes a creature on your opponent's turn. Kind of the same thing as the Omnivore, where it does stand to threaten to block pretty big things, right? 3 and 4 mana cards a lot of the time. So that's a card I've been playing more and more. Spectral Interference, that's another pretty good one. The 2 mana counterspell, like that's a card that I found retains its relevance as the game goes on. If you need to play it on 2, great, you play it on 2. If you play it on 6, you're often going to be able to nab something. One card I want to call out that I think kind of looks like it does this, what I'm talking about, retains relevance as the game goes on, but I don't think quite in the right way. I think it's just a little too clunky, is Prowlcatcher Specialist. This is the 2 mana 2/1 in red. It's got haste and you can exhaust it for 4 mana to put 2 counters on it. I've just found, even in my games where I'm a little bit light on action, things to do, I just never feel good about activating that ability, right? Like, when you have nothing to do, it's better than nothing, of course. But I also feel like if I get flooded a bit, this isn't really like an answer to getting flooded a bit. It still isn't that relevant. It's still like having to put 4 mana often doesn't match up versus what your opponent might be doing on a future turn, right? Like those other cards I just talked about, the 4/1, the 3/2, you pay 2 mana, set it and forget it. It's done its thing. It can trade up. Specialist, I would advise against it still. I still like it sometimes if you care about exhaust. If you have a lot of exhaust payoffs, sure, it's a reason to play it. But I just wanted to separate that from the rest of the group. Anyways, yeah, if you take anything away from this, and again, this is something that I've been doing more and more, just do play more 2-drops, prioritize them higher. And again, not because I think you just like absolutely need a bundle of them. I actually think a deck with like 10 2-drops is going to be performing pretty poorly in this format. But you do need to have that 6 or 7 to make sure that you have a good spread in your matchups. Make sure you don't die to the aggro decks. And you want to make sure those 2-drops retain the relevance as the game goes on. Prioritize the ones super, super highly that do that naturally, like the Lagak and the Flyers and all that. All right, next up, we're going to talk about 2 decks that I haven't gone in depth on throughout the format. 2 red decks. People have been asking me to talk about the red decks because I think all things considered, they're the decks that I talk about the least. So we're going to do a little bit of a deck tech with red-black and blue-black. Not going to be super in-depth deck techs or anything. We're just going to take a few minutes on each. I would really recommend, as always, going to check out Sam Black's podcast, Drafting Archetypes. He's done episodes on black, red, and blue, black. So if you want like a full 45-minute breakdown of those decks, go check out Sam's podcast. But I do want to share some insights of what I found to be effective for these decks, the cards you're looking for, what brings you in, what makes you want to draft these decks. We're going to start with red-black because I think this is my most drafted red deck. And let's just start with what draws you in. Mostly the Thrill Seeker. We talked about this card a lot a few minutes ago. Gastel Thrill Seeker, red-black 2/3, start your engines. When it comes in, drain your opponent for 1. And when you have max speed, this thing has Death Touch and Haste. Again, just super powerful card, really, really strong. And Far Fortune. That's the gold red-black card, the 4/5 that pings your opponent on attacks. When you get to max speed, all your things deal damage. They're damage +1. That includes the attack of Far Fortune, of course. So yeah, this is a deck that I think you get drawn in because of the gold cards. It's not often a deck I'm just like, oh, red and black are just open, and I'll draft them, and maybe I'll get the gold cards. I think that these 2 cards are fairly important to making a really good red-black deck tick. So yeah, often it'll be like first pick Far Fortune or, a 4th or 3rd pick Thrill Seeker that draws me in. The way I concept red-black is an aggro deck, just like you want to get to max speed, you want to be dealing early damage, you want to play a 1 and 2 into a 3, start attacking, just your typical aggro deck. But why it's well positioned in the format and why I think it's the best aggressive deck in the format is because unlike other decks, other aggro decks that might get brick walled by, just like a 4 mana 4/4 or a Ketradon, red-black cares a lot less about that. It's still able to deal damage in small increments, even if the board is stalled out. Often when I play against red-black, it's pretty scary if they can deal the first, 10 points. Usually when you play against, a red-white aggro deck, if they deal the first 10 points, then you stabilize, there's often not too much they can do. If the board's stalled out, if you've got control of the board, the red-white aggro deck, not even necessarily in this format, but like in any format, just think of a red-white aggro deck. They have a tough time pushing through, right? Unless they draw like flyers or, some mass pump spell or something. When I face red-black in this format and they get me down to 10, they're at max speed, I really feel like, oh man, I probably already lost this game. Because not only are their cards going to be a little bit better, all their cards, because all their Start Their Engines cards are going to be turned on, meaning their average draw is probably going to rival your average draw as the slower deck, maybe be even a little bit better. But mostly, I don't feel safe at like 10 life because there's a lot of ways to just deal the last 10 points. And if you're drafting red-black, I would really prioritize them. So cards you're looking for here. Apocalypse Runner. This is the other gold card. The vehicle, the 6/5. Tap it, give something, power 2 or less, lifelink, and can't be blocked. So just, this is a must answer. If your opponent is at 10, your opponent just has to kill this thing. It plays really nicely with Mutant Surveyor, which is the best Surveyor of the bunch, by the way. I think this one's like clearly head and shoulders above all the other ones. The other ones are kind of whatever. But this Mutant Surveyor I actually like in most black decks. 3 mana, 2/3, can pump for 2 mana. I'm sure you can see the combo, even if you haven't played this before. You make the Surveyor unblockable, and then you pump it after you do that. You get through for 5 points or whatever. Apocalypse Runner also plays pretty well with Pedal to the Metal, which is a card I play in this deck sometimes, which is the X and a red instant, give target creature +X/+0 and first strike. Pedal to the Metal also plays nicely with the Thrill Seeker, right? Because that's a Death Touch creature, Death Touch plus first strike. Nice little natural combo. Also, Engine Rat is a card that you're going to play in this deck pretty often. That's another Death Toucher. So yeah, Apocalypse Runner is a card that I've really liked in these decks, more than I thought I would. I remember when the first previews came out and I saw Apocalypse Runner next to all the other gold cards in the set. I was like, this one seems like one of the not-so-great ones. And, I think there are a lot of really good gold cards, so it's still true. But it's definitely exceeded my expectations. I do like it quite a bit in Black-Red. And then past that, you're looking at stuff like Pactol Terror. You're looking at the aforementioned Engine Rat. You're looking at stuff like Risky Shortcut. That's the draw 2, each player loses 2 life. Thunderhead Gunner, good everywhere pretty much, but good in this deck so you can just churn through your deck and find those relevant cards, those cards that push damage even in a board stall. I think Gunner is pretty important to not getting flooded in this kind of deck. Also, a card that Sam called out that wasn't on my radar, but Burner Rocket, and it makes sense, right? Like if you're just caring about dealing the last few points, something like Burner Rocket plus Mutant Surveyor is a nice little combo. By the way, for those just listening, Burner Rocket is the 2 mana 3/1 vehicle with Flash. Comes in, gives something +2/+0 and Trample. Not a card I like very much. It's a card that I just generally don't play. But again, in red-black, if you're just looking for like that last few points and you're already pretty good at draining them, you've got the other cards that deal a bunch of damage outside of combat, I think Burner Rocket's a fine include. So yeah, where I think a lot of red-black decks fail is in their inability to get in, right? I've seen a lot of red-black decks be built as just like, the typical aggro deck where you just have a super lean curve, just hoping to attack. But as we know, as anybody who's played this format a lot knows, that plan of just like, well, I just hope my creatures can naturally attack, get through the opponent's blockers, they're 4/4s. It doesn't work that well, right? The opponents usually on turn 3, 4, 5 can put up pretty good defenses, are pretty good at stalling aggro. So yeah, if you've drafted red-black and haven't quite found the secret sauce, it's probably that you're not prioritizing the non-combat ways to deal the last 10 points. I think those are really, really important. And then let's talk about red-blue. So red-blue has been an interesting one. I've seen a lot of people be kind of confused as to how red-blue should be built, as in, like, strategically, what is this deck doing? Because you can see on face value, anybody drafting this deck goes, oh, okay, red-black is a discard deck. It wants me to cycle cards, wants me to, have these payoffs and these enablers. But when it comes down to it, strategically and structurally, like, what is this deck trying to do? And I actually think it's a pretty important concept when you're trying to just figure out a limited format. WotC's got their things that they've laid out, like, here's what all the 10 color pairs are doing. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not so helpful. Like, for blue-black in this format, I thought it was funny that if you look on the main draft page, blue-black is like, scare your opponent silly with toys. Or it's like just like completely not related to what the deck is actually doing. I mean, sure, like flavorfully, sure, it checks out with, the Pactol Terrors and such. In game, that is what happens. But as far as like what cards you want to prioritize, it doesn't really point you in the right direction. It doesn't really tell you, hey, this is what kind of deck it is. And so I think it's pretty helpful to, in every set, just give a rough concept or archetype label to it. For red-black, I was saying that, the way that deck operates is it's an aggro deck that drains the opponent out with you want to prioritize the cards that deal non-combat damage to drain the opponent out, right? Just kind of that rough concept to really get to the next level that's not just, okay, I'm gonna start my engines deck, because that doesn't tell you that much, right? I think it doesn't really inform what the cards you should be drafting. And I think red-blue kind of suffers from the same thing, where it's like, oh, sure, it's a discard deck. You can see that pretty easily. The cards want you to discard cards or draw your second card per turn. But what are the other cards you're filling your deck with, right? Your deck isn't going to be 23 payoffs and enablers. The other cards in your deck that don't fall into one of those columns with payoff or enabler, the other cards in your deck should support whatever broad magic archetype your deck is, right? Like, is it tempo, aggro, control, all that kind of stuff, right? You need to be picking the right support cards. And I think blue-red through and through is a tempo deck, right? It's a deck that wants to stick a cheap threat and keep your opponent off balance and just kill them before they can empty their hand, right? Kind of adjacent to an aggro deck, but where an aggro deck generally relies on a lot of creatures, a lot of cheap creatures, the tempo decks, they often are like, well, I have one creature that deals a lot of damage. So obviously, the cards that fall into that camp are the uncommon payoffs, the Mako, the shark that grows whenever you cycle, the Skyray, the flyer that grows whenever you cycle, the rare, Captain Howler, which is the 5/4, Ward 2, pay 2 life. You can pump a creature whenever you discard a card, and that creature will draw you a card if it hits your opponent, right? These are the classic kind of like, yeah, this thing can just solo the game by itself. Another few good rares for this kind of approach. Burnout Bastronaut, that's the 1-drop in red, 1/1 menace. Got to start your engines. You can pump it to give it +1 for 2 mana. At max speed, it has double strike, so you can see how that thing can go all the way. Hell Squad Heavy might be the best rare for this deck. This is the 3 mana 3/2 that makes a goblin every turn. So if you just play this, you cast a bounce spell, keep your opponent off balance. So this just gets in a few times. It's very easy to win the game with that. Thopter Fabricator, it's another good one. The 4/4 flying vehicle that makes 1/1s whenever you draw your second card per turn. So you're really looking to prioritize these cards. And I think these cards in particular, a lot of these cards I talked about are rares, but there's some uncommons there too. If you don't have the cheap threats, I think the deck just doesn't really function. You just really need to get on board early, get on board with a powerful threat, something that is very threatening, something your opponent goes, oh, I have to answer that. Or else, yeah, your tempo deck just isn't going to work very well. And luckily, something that supports that plan great, one of the best tempo spells of all time, just classic, tried and true, is just an unsummon, right? Bounce off in this set. Bounce a creature or a vehicle. Like, this is the exact kind of deck that you want this card in. Because, in most blue decks, you'll play a copy or two. You're like, okay, sure. Like, I just can sneak it in, maybe blow out a combat trick, maybe blow out a double block. But in this deck, you're going to use it proactively. You're going to be like, bounce your 4/4, get in for a big hit of 5. You play that thing again, I bounce it again, maybe I trip it up. Trip up is a card that makes these decks. That's kind of what you're doing here. So I think, what that means is that getting into blue-red is a matter of seeing the good payoffs. Because if you don't have, I would say, 4 or 5 of these good payoffs, either the rares or the Mako or the Skyray, the deck's just gonna kind of flop. I mean, you can get their own card quality. I'm not saying there's never going to be a case where just blue and red are open enough, you get good enough cards. But I do think the majority of successful blue-red decks follow that plan, right? They just want to go Mako, Skyray, cycle, kill you before you can stabilize. And if you're enjoying the show and you want to see us keep the lights on, do go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's where you can go to best support me or any of my content. There's a link in the YouTube description. Also, if you're listening to the podcast, it'll be in the audio description there. There's a bunch of benefits on that Patreon where if you want to support us, we want to give back to you in multiple different ways. There's coaching available on that Patreon. There's deck tech help, draft log review help, all that kind of stuff. All things that help you get better at Limited Magic. And if you want to support the show in a non-monetary way, do just like the video, comment. If you're listening to the podcast audio only, go to YouTube, give it a quick like, give the channel a subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, thank you so much. Back to the show. And final section for today, I just want to talk about a bunch of cards. Some cards that I think are still underrated at this point in the format. Some collections of cards or 2-card combos, 2-card interactions, some things that might not come up all that often, but are good to know about. So when it's relevant, you can put them into practice. And we're gonna start with cards that exile themselves from your graveyard, or sorry, cards that can exile things from your graveyard at will. So mostly we're talking Earth Rumbler and Molt Tender. Earth Rumbler being the 5-mana vehicle that you can exile a card from your graveyard, artifact or creature specifically, to wake up the vehicle. And Molt Tender, the single mana green mana dork that exile a card from your graveyard, add 1 mana of any color. So this comes up a few places where you might want to just exile a card from your graveyard for various reasons. So Dredger's Insight is one that I see some people kind of forget about sometimes. So Insight is the 2-mana enchantment in green that when you cast it, you mill 4 cards. You can return a creature or artifact from those mill cards, and Also has a line of text. Whenever one or more artifacts you control leave the graveyard, you gain a life. And it's very easy to shortcut that to just, when you get the card back from Judge's Insight that you've milled, you gain a life. But no, of course, it counts all of your other things that exile cards from the graveyard or return things back from the graveyard to the battlefield. So I've seen a lot of board states where, my opponent's got an Insight and maybe a Molt Tender or an Earth Rumbler, and I'm trying to do combat math and be like, okay, well, I can kill them over 2 turns, but they can exile a card from their graveyard with their Molt Tender. And the opponent just I guess just forgot that Judge's Insight has that line of text that affects everything. So just be aware of that. That's kind of the basic one. A few other things you can do though. River Churn Monument, Earth Rumbler, is really, really nice at combating River Churn Monument, which is the rare mill artifact. The relevant part here is it has the exhaust ability, 4 mana, tap it, any number of target players mill cards equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. Earth Rumbler and Molt Tender, although much slower at doing that, does give you some insurance against Monument. So, especially in these black-green decks that you are self-milling a bunch, you can be kind of soft to Monument, and so having some sort of out to it is pretty nice. And for, the spicy people out there, people that want to go deep, people that on week 7 of the format, they just go, I just want to do the fun thing. I think it's one of the better ways. These cards are one of the better ways to turn on Ketramos, the white-black rare, so I can see something going on there. I haven't done that myself. But I think there is something there if you wanted to go deep. If you wanted to be like, yeah, let's make this card that generally, doesn't really work into a real card. I can't say I recommend it, but for the dreamers out there. Another card that has quite a few interactions is Veteran Beast Rider. This is the Selesnya Gold Uncommon, the 3/4 that untaps all creatures your end step, and then you can pay 4 mana to pump your creatures, give them +1/+1. So the untap part here is pretty relevant, pretty interesting, right? So there's the combo of Beast Rider plus Bastry, the 2/1 rare that you can exert to make a 1/1 token. Mengu mentioned this one when he was on the podcast a few weeks ago. And the combo here is that you can basically make a token every single turn, of course, because exert means, okay, well, it doesn't untap, but Beast Rider overrides that. That one's kind of obvious. You can also do the same thing with Unswerving Sloth. That's the 5 mana 5/5 that when you saddle it and attack, you untap all your creatures. So some similar things going on there. And basically, this works for any activated tap ability. There's not too many of them in the set for what it's worth, right? But if you can find a few more that you can use multiple times a turn, that's pretty nice. Often you just think like, okay, Beast Rider's there to give your creatures vigilance, but sometimes you actually have an activated ability in the mix. Beast Rider also plays pretty nicely with Veloheart Bike, which is the 3 mana Manolith vehicle, the 4/2 that taps to add a mana of any color, because you can crew it even after you've tapped it. So what you do is you tap it for mana, and then you crew it with a creature that you don't care about attacking with that turn. The bike then becomes a creature, will untap during your opponent's turn, and sometimes that means you get to double spell, sometimes it means you get to activate Beast Rider plus cast a spell, or use Beast Rider on attacks, and then bike untaps, and you get to do it on blocks as well. So basically just crewing the bike at some point during your turn will give you the untap, give you the additional mana on the opponent's turn. Also, it's kind of nice with the Beast Rider because once you get to 8 mana with Beast Rider and able to give +2/+2, the game often just ends on the spot. So, Bike just being an additional mana source is kind of nice there. So, when I have Beast Rider, I do like to prioritize a bike. And yeah, if you can get the Bastry combo, that's great. Howl Squad Heavy, which is the red 2/3 that makes a goblin every turn. So I feel kind of dumb. Mission on this one. I missed the idea, the joke with this card for a while. I remember drafting this card, really highly. It's a good card just in general. But I remember looking at the win rate of like, wow, this is one of the best cards in the set. But every time I play it, it just kind of gets bricked or just dies or it didn't seem like one of the absolute best cards in the set. But of course, the joke here is it's really good with vehicles, right? You want to be able to make that 1/1 goblin not have to suicide in for a turn. You want to make sure that you can crew it with a vehicle so that you can, keep accruing goblins, make a goblin every single turn. The goblins only have to attack on the first turn they come down. So yeah, I know. I'm sure a lot of people are like, Alex, that's really obvious. Like, that's kind of what the card's doing. But I'm sure there's some people like me that didn't quite key into that. So, if that's you, then now you know. And if you're somebody who picked up on that pretty early, well, point to you. One for you, 0 for Alex on this one. Speaking of River Churn Monuments, like we were a few minutes ago, one way that you can prevent decking, if only for just a turn, is with Trip Up. This is the 4 mana, put something on top or bottom of its owner's library. So often the opponent goes exhaust on their turn, and then on your turn you go trip up on my upkeep, put a card on top. Sometimes that's enough, right? Sometimes you just need that one turn. You know, I'm sure if you face Riverturn Monument, you've been in a few spots where it's just like, man, if I just had one more turn against that monument, and trip up can give you that one more turn sometimes. So just once again, something that doesn't come up too often, but I've done this and won the game because of it. A few underrated cards. One I'm going to call out that I've called out, I think, pretty much on every single Aetherdrift episode. Marshall's Path Cruiser, the 3 mana 6/5 vehicle that goes and gets a land. And I wanted to say that I do think this card is good in every deck. You know, I've been talking up this card over and over and over and over again. But maybe something that I haven't said, which is why I think it's worth repeating even, one last time. Got to send the format off talking about Path Cruiser. Is I don't think you need to be exhausting this card at all, right? It's just good. And you need to have a high creature count to be able to crew it, sure. But in most decks with like 15, 14 creatures, yeah, it's just going to be good. Just treat it as a good colorless card. I will draft it pretty highly. Lets you splash. Is a massive threat. And the reason I feel like it is worth repeating here is I still do see this card wheel sometimes. So I don't think it's a card that should be wheeling. And I apologize if you've tuned in every single week and heard me say, all right, yeah, Path Cruiser good, Path Cruiser is good, but I'm sure there's somebody out there who this will be their first time hearing it, and just want to get that final PSA out. I promise, I won't talk about the card again. Next up, Defend the Rider. Single green mana, instant protection spell. Make something indestructible and hexproof, or make a 1/1 token. I like this card a lot. Another card I see a little bit later than, I would draft it if I was just drafting it at a table of all me's. Just such an impactful effect for a single mana. Wins a combat, blows out a removal spell. Often I find that, the games hinge on just one powerful threat, one big thing coming down and sticking. You play your gunner, the opponent goes to remove it, you defend the rider. That's often like a giant turning point in the game. So yeah, I just would play this in every single one of my green decks, as long as I'm creature heavy enough, of course, and most green decks are. I can't imagine too many green decks that don't have enough creatures that I wouldn't play Defend the Rider. Also, a thing I like about the card is sometimes you just are able to eat a creature in combat with it, where you just have vehicles in the battlefield. Your opponent attacks into you, thinking you can't crew the vehicle. You flash in the token. Okay, you wake up your 4/4 vehicle or whatever it is. So just, good flexibility. Just, I think people know this card is good. It's not like some sleeper card, but I would bump it up, I think, even a little bit more compared to where most people are taking it now. Then another card I see going pretty late is Market Backwalker. The XX artifact creature comes in with X +1/+1 counters. You can pay 4 mana to put a counter on it. And when it dies, you draw X cards where X is the number of counters on it. Got a lot of questions about this one on stream, actually. Like, why is it good? Where is it good? Is it good in certain decks? I think it's good in most decks. Like, in your slower decks, you're happy with this card basically at any point in the curve. Like, 2 mana 1/1 that either trades or just chumps and draws you a card. 4 mana 2/2 trades, draws you 2 cards. It's just a really annoying card for any beefy green deck to face. In your more aggressive decks, maybe you don't want it as much, but even something like Black-White, I found it to be pretty good. In Black-White, to be fair, you have access to a few sacrifice outlets here and there. Not very many, but at rare, there's a couple. And if you do have a sacrifice effect, then this card, just goes way up, just threaten to draw a million cards, 5 cards, 6 cards or something as in a long game. So yeah, I don't think it's a crazy bomb that people are passing or anything, but I see this card 5th pick sometimes, and I don't think it should go 5th pick. Like, it's more of like a 1st to 3rd kind of card. So again, if you're like, it kind of looks weird, I would just recommend drafting it a little bit higher. Again, a little bit better in your slower decks, but pretty much good anywhere. And that's gonna do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you made it this far and you're on YouTube, do give a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Next week, in the next few weeks before Tarkir Dragonstorm comes out, I have a few level up episodes, a few evergreen level up episodes coming out. Part of the reason why this is the last Aetherdrift episode is I do have a few non-Aetherdrift related episodes that I want to get out there. So if you are an evergreen level up episode enjoyer, rejoice. So look forward to that, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.